A Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd were walking through a burnt forest when a sudden bark changed everything. Running through the ash, they found a hidden green valley where an old man stood completely alone. He held nothing but an iron bar to defend his wife's trees against two loggers with chainsaws. He was seconds away from losing his life until the soldier and his dog stepped out of the shadows to protect him. But what happened next in that valley wasn't just a fight over wood. It was a secret that would pull a broken family right out of the ashes. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from, and if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The Pacific Northwest was usually a sprawling, breathtaking canvas of vibrant emerald canopies and deep sapphire skies, a living testament to nature's untamed vitality. But today, as the heavy tires of a matte black pickup truck crunched to a halt against the gravel shoulder of the winding mountain highway, the view was profoundly, tragically different. A recent devastating wildfire had violently swept through this massive expanse of national forest, leaving behind a hauntingly silent graveyard of charred, skeletal timber. Thousands of towering pine and fir trees, once the proud, ancient guardians of the region, now stood as blackened monoliths against a heavy, mist-laden gray sky. The biting mountain air still carried the faint, bitter acridity of wood smoke, a lingering ghost of the inferno that had consumed the land. Inside the truck sat Jack, a man intimately familiar with the profound, echoing silence that always followed a fierce, destructive battle. Jack was a Navy SEAL, currently utilizing a brief but much-needed period of leave before reporting to a new command base further up the coastline. He was a tall, solidly built man in his early 30s, his posture naturally rigid with years of grueling military discipline. He wore his standard-issue NWU Type 3 uniform, the digital woodland camouflage pattern designed to blend perfectly with the lush, natural environments he usually operated in, though today it stood in stark, ironic contrast to the monochrome wasteland before him. His face featured a strong, angular jawline covered in a light, rugged stubble, but it was his eyes that revealed his true narrative. They were a piercing shade of hazel, constantly observant and sharply calculating, yet holding a quiet, unmistakable weariness, the kind of heavy spiritual fatigue that came not from a mere lack of sleep, but from witnessing far too much of the world's harsh, unforgiving realities. "All right, buddy, let's stretch our legs," Jack said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that easily broke the oppressive stillness of the dead forest as he cut the engine. Beside him, occupying the passenger seat with the regal authority of a king on his throne, was Duke. Duke was a purebred German Shepherd, massive and heavily muscled, sporting a classic, thick black and tan coat that gleamed with vitality despite the gloomy surroundings. Outfitted in a rugged, coyote-brown tactical harness, Duke was infinitely more than just a pet. He was a steadfast anchor for Jack's soul, a brilliantly intelligent, silent confidant who absorbed the soldier's unspoken traumas without ever demanding an explanation. Duke let out a soft, eager whine, his sharp, triangular ears swiveling forward as he anticipated the command to move. Jack opened the door, stepping out onto the ash-covered earth, the crunch of his combat boots sounding unnaturally loud in the void. He securely clipped a heavy-duty tactical leash to Duke's harness, and with a swift, fluid motion, the large dog bounded out of the cabin, his heavy paws landing softly on the soot-stained ground. The sheer desolation of the landscape was breathtaking in its immense tragedy. As far as the eye could see, the earth was scorched black, the vibrant underbrush completely vaporized by the intense, merciless heat. Jack took a deep breath of the cool, damp air, surprisingly feeling a strange sense of kinship with the scarred terrain. In many ways, the scorched earth perfectly mirrored the internal landscape of a seasoned combat veteran, burned over, scarred, abruptly stripped of its superficial layers, yet fundamentally enduring. "Looks like an absolute war zone out here, doesn't it, pal?" Jack murmured softly, instinctively adjusting the collar of his uniform against the biting chill of the mountain breeze. They began to walk slowly along the edge of the devastated tree line, their boots and paws kicking up tiny, ghost-like clouds of gray dust. Duke, ever the inquisitive and relentless explorer, kept his wet nose close to the ground, aggressively sniffing at the unfamiliar, charred scents of the altered ecosystem. Suddenly, the large dog stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered his massive head toward the base of a completely incinerated redwood trunk. Jack tightened his grip on the nylon leash, his deeply ingrained tactical instincts instantly flaring up as his eyes rapidly scanned the perimeter for potential threats. A surviving, desperate wild animal, perhaps, or a patch of dangerously unstable ground. "What is it, Duke? What do you see?" Jack asked, stepping cautiously closer. Duke didn't growl. Instead, he let out a highly uncharacteristic, high-pitched snort of absolute confusion. Jack knelt beside his canine companion, his hazel eyes closely following the dog's intense, focused gaze. There, pushing its way defiantly through a thick, suffocating layer of toxic white ash and blackened wood chips, was a tiny, vibrant green sapling. It was no taller than Jack's thumb, possessing only 2 fragile, translucent leaves, yet it radiated an almost aggressive, undeniable will to live. Duke gingerly extended his wet black nose, giving the tiny plant a deep, inquisitive sniff. The sheer, sudden force of the large dog's exhalation made the little sapling tremble violently, as if caught in a miniature hurricane. Duke immediately jumped back a foot, clearly startled by the unexpected movement he had caused, his head tilting sharply to the side in profound, comical bewilderment. Jack couldn't help but let out a genuine, rumbling laugh, the rich sound feeling unfamiliar but incredibly good in his tight chest. "Easy there, killer," Jack chuckled warmly, reaching out to give Duke a firm, affectionate rub behind his ears. "It's just a baby tree. It somehow survived the fire." Jack stared down at the fragile green shoot, the rare smile slowly fading into a look of deep, quiet reverence. Here was a profound lesson beautifully written in the ruined soil. No matter how devastating the fire, no matter how absolute the destruction seemed to be, life possessed an agonizingly stubborn refusal to surrender. It was a poignant lesson Jack desperately needed to internalize for his own ongoing healing. That's pure resilience, Duke. You take the fire, you let it burn away the dead wood, and then you start over. You just keep growing. Duke seemed to process the profound, quiet moment for a fleeting second before his entire demeanor radically and terrifyingly shifted. The playful curiosity vanished instantly, entirely replaced by the hyper-focused, lethal intensity of a highly trained working dog. His muscular body went completely rigid, the thick fur along his spine standing up in a sharp, aggressive ridge. His ears locked onto a sound deep within the foggy, ruined timberland, a subtle disturbance completely imperceptible to human ears. A low, menacing, guttural growl began to vibrate deep within Duke's broad chest, a dangerous sound that immediately triggered Jack's combat reflexes. Jack stood up swiftly, his previously relaxed posture instantly transforming into a poised, defensive tactical stance, his eyes narrowing sharply as he tried to pierce the dense, misty veil hanging heavily over the blackened forest. "Duke, heel!" Jack commanded sharply, his voice carrying the unquestionable, hard authority of a commanding seal. But the stern command fell on completely deaf ears. Whatever Duke sensed lurking in the gloom was simply too urgent, too primal to ignore. With an explosive, terrifying surge of raw, unadulterated canine power, Duke lunged forward. The sudden, violent force of the large dog's rapid acceleration caught Jack completely off guard. The thick nylon loop of the leash was violently ripped from Jack's heavily calloused hand, burning the skin as it tore aggressively free. "Duke, no!" Jack roared, the desperate command echoing uselessly off the dead, hollow trees. But it was far too late. Duke was already a dark, blurred projectile tearing through the airborne ash, barking furiously as he completely disappeared into the thick, gray fog that blanketed the sprawling graveyard of trees. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline slammed violently into Jack's bloodstream. His heart hammered rapidly against his ribs as he immediately sprinted after his dog, his heavy boots desperately pounding against the scorched earth, plunging headlong into the eerie, silent unknown of the ruined forest. The pursuit through the devastated landscape was a jarring test of physical endurance and sensory deprivation. Jack's heavy combat boots pounded rhythmically against the brittle, scorched earth, kicking up thick, suffocating clouds of gray ash that coated his uniform and stung his eyes. He tracked Duke's trajectory not by sight, for the dense, lingering fog and towering black monoliths of the burnt forest obscured everything beyond 50 yards, but by the fading, frantic echoes of the German shepherd's barks and the deep, aggressive gouges left by his heavy paws in the soot. Jack's breathing remained remarkably controlled, a testament to years of grueling Navy SEAL conditioning, but a cold knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. The woods were treacherous. Weakened, hollowed-out tree trunks could collapse at any moment, and hidden, smoldering root systems created invisible sinkholes of blistering heat. Yet, as Jack pushed deeper into the desolate terrain, he noticed a sudden, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere. The biting, acrid stench of dead wood and toxic smoke that had assaulted his lungs since he parked the truck began to thin, gradually replaced by a cool, fragrant dampness. The harsh, howling wind of the exposed ridge died down, buffered by a drastic change in the topography. The ground beneath Jack's boots began to slope sharply downward, leading him into a massive, naturally formed geographic depression. A steep ravine that the raging inferno had somehow, miraculously, swept right over. As Jack descended into the basin, the impenetrable veil of gray fog parted, revealing a sight so breathtakingly surreal that it forced the seasoned soldier to momentarily halt his sprint. It was a literal oasis of life, thriving violently in the center of an ocean of death. Before him lay a pristine, hidden valley, a vibrant explosion of emerald green that defied the catastrophic destruction surrounding it. A small, rustic wooden cabin with a rusted tin roof sat peacefully near a crystal-clear, babbling creek, completely untouched by the flames. But it was the trees that truly commanded awe. A magnificent grove of ancient, towering cedar trees stood like silent, majestic sentinels around the property. Their massive, heavily textured trunks were easily 10 feet in diameter, supporting sprawling, lush canopies that filtered the meager sunlight into soft, ethereal beams of gold and green. The stark, poetic contrast between the charred, apocalyptic wasteland above and this vibrant, breathing sanctuary below struck a deep chord within Jack's soul. It reminded him of finding a remarkably untouched, beautifully preserved cathedral standing proudly amidst the rubble of a heavily bombed city. It was a profound manifestation of hope, a stubborn pocket of resilience where the earth had fiercely protected its most precious legacy. However, the profound tranquility of the hidden Eden was violently shattered by the harsh, unnatural sound of angry human voices echoing through the ancient trunks. Jack's tactical instincts flared instantly. He dropped into a low, predatory crouch, using the thick, unburnt underbrush as cover, while he swiftly closed the distance toward the cabin, his hazel eyes scanning the clearing for Duke and the source of the commotion. At the edge of the grove, standing with his back pressed protectively against the most colossal cedar tree in the valley, was an old man. This had to be the owner of the sanctuary. He was a fragile, skeletal figure, his posture deeply stooped by the undeniable weight of advanced age and profound grief. He wore faded, dirt-stained denim overalls over a worn flannel shirt, his thin, wispy silver hair plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. His deeply lined face was pale and drawn, yet his pale blue eyes burned with a fierce, desperate, and heartbreaking defiance. His frail, heavily veined hands were trembling violently, not from the mountain chill, but from sheer adrenaline as he desperately gripped a heavy, rusted iron pry bar, holding it out like a pathetic but determined sword against his adversaries. Facing the old man, radiating malicious intent, were two massive, heavily built loggers who clearly did not belong in this sacred space. The first man was a hulking brute with a thick, untamed ginger beard, wearing a stained, high-visibility yellow vest over a torn thermal shirt. He chewed aggressively on a wooden matchstick, his small, piggy eyes glinting with cruel opportunism. His companion was slightly shorter but incredibly wide, featuring a completely bald head and thick, muscular arms covered in faded, poorly executed tribal tattoos. Both men possessed the rough, uncaring demeanor of scavengers looking to exploit a tragedy, reeking of cheap, stale tobacco, dried sweat, and the sharp chemical scent of machine oil. They had clearly used the chaotic aftermath of the wildfire as the perfect cover to infiltrate the restricted national forest, aiming to illegally harvest these priceless ancient cedars. "Listen, old man, you're making this much harder than it needs to be," the bearded logger sneered, his voice a nasty, grating rumble that completely disrespected the quiet majesty of the grove. "The fire wiped out the access roads. Nobody is coming to check on this valley for months. You can either step aside and let us take a few of these overgrown weeds, or you can have a very unfortunate, fatal accident out here in the woods. Nobody would ever know." The old man, Elias, merely tightened his trembling grip on the heavy iron bar, his knuckles turning stark white. "You will not touch Martha's trees," Elias rasped, his voice fragile but laced with a profound, immovable love. "You'll have to kill me first." The tattooed logger let out a dark, ugly laugh, violently yanking the pull cord of the massive, industrial-grade chainsaw resting in his thick hands. The engine sputtered, then roared to life with a deafening, terrifying screech that brutally violated the sanctity of the hidden valley. A toxic cloud of blue exhaust choked the fragrant air. The bearded man followed suit, starting his own machine, the dual roar of the cutting teeth spinning at lethal speeds, sounding like mechanical monsters hungry for blood and sap. They took a menacing, synchronized step toward the frail old man, the jagged blades gleaming menacingly in the dappled sunlight. Elias closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable violence, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. But before the loggers could take another step, the dense underbrush to their left exploded in a furious blur of black and tan. Duke burst into the clearing like a highly trained missile, his muscular body launching through the air. He didn't attack blindly. Instead, the massive German shepherd landed squarely between the terrified old man and the revving chainsaws, his front paws planted firmly in the soft earth. Duke bared his sharp white teeth, the thick fur on his back standing at absolute attention as he unleashed a thunderous, savage bark that effortlessly cut through the deafening noise of the engines, announcing that the old man was no longer fighting this battle alone. The deafening, mechanical roar of the heavy chainsaws momentarily faltered, not from any sudden engine failure, but from the sheer, paralyzing shock of Duke's explosive and aggressive materialization. The massive German shepherd stood his ground perfectly, a quivering, magnificent monument of canine fury, his deep, resonant barks acting as a literal physical barrier against the two colossal, menacing loggers. Before the hulking men could fully process the unexpected arrival of the highly trained dog, the thick, vibrant underbrush at the edge of the ancient cedar grove parted once more. Jack emerged from the ethereal, mist-laced shadows of the valley, his arrival completely devoid of any frantic, cinematic heroism or dramatic, booming shouts. Instead, he moved with the chilling, calculated fluidity of a natural predator at the absolute apex of the food chain, his every measured step echoing the silent, lethal discipline instilled by years of elite Navy SEAL operations. He didn't carry a visible firearm. His imposing physical posture and his piercing, unblinking hazel eyes were devastating weapons in their own right. The digital woodland camouflage pattern of his uniform, which had previously been a jarring, ironic anomaly in the charred, monochrome wasteland above, now blended seamlessly with the deep, rich greens and earthy browns of the hidden oasis, making him appear as if the ancient forest itself had magically manifested a fierce, unyielding guardian. He smoothly and purposefully positioned himself directly between the fragile, trembling form of the old man and the idling, toxic fuming machinery held tightly by the hostile intruders. He stood perfectly still, his broad, muscular shoulders squared, acting as an impenetrable, living wall of steel. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his physical presence instantly altered the atmospheric pressure in the small clearing. The bearded logger's wide eyes darted nervously from the snarling, foam-flecked jaws of the heavily muscled dog to the stony, emotionally detached visage of the seasoned soldier, his initially aggressive sneer slowly dissolving into a transparent mask of uncertain hesitation and sudden fear. "I highly suggest you power those toys down immediately," Jack stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the mechanical noise, yet possessed a terrifying, uncompromising authority that inherently demanded absolute obedience. "You are trespassing on private property, and you are currently threatening a profoundly outmatched old man. This is your first and only warning to leave this valley before things become significantly more painful and complicated for both of you." The heavily tattooed logger, seemingly desperate to salvage his rapidly bruising ego in front of his partner, tightened his sweaty, white-knuckled grip on the thick handle of his heavy chainsaw, aggressively gunning the two-stroke engine so that it let out a high-pitched, threatening shriek that violently disturbed the peaceful canopy above. "Who do you think you are? Some kind of glorified forest ranger?" he spat angrily, launching a thick stream of dark tobacco juice onto the pristine, moss-covered soil near Jack's combat boots. He took a bold, heavy step forward, an act of sheer, foolish, and ultimately reckless defiance. A powerful, explosive upward lunge, the powerful, explosive upward lunge, the large shepherd snapped his strong jaws not at the man's arm, but at the grimy, sweat-stained trucker hat resting low on the tattooed man's bald head. In an absolute blur of black and tan motion, Duke effortlessly tore the cap away, landing gracefully back on all four paws in a perfect defensive stance. The sheer suddenness of the unexpected action made the large logger flinch violently backward in pure panic, stumbling clumsily over a thick, exposed cedar root and nearly dropping his heavy, dangerous cutting equipment. Duke clamped his strong jaws tightly around the soiled fabric of the hat, planting his front paws wide apart, and emitted a low, continuous, rumbling growl that vibrated audibly through the trapped fabric. It was an undeniably terrifying sound, yet it created an intensely comical, deeply absurd visual, this highly trained, exceptionally lethal animal standing vigilant guard while aggressively holding a dirty, worthless piece of headwear hostage. Jack didn't break his cold, intimidating stare, but the faintest ghost of an amused, appreciative smirk briefly tugged at the corner of his mouth. The sudden, humiliating loss of his hat, combined with the unyielding, deadly calm of the solitary man standing before him, finally and completely shattered the tattooed logger's fragile, manufactured bravado. He fumbled frantically with his thick thumbs to hit the plastic kill switch on his saw, the mechanical roar dying instantly into a pathetic, wheezing sputter. Seeing his partner fold so easily, the bearded man reluctantly powered down his own vibrating machine, allowing a heavy, profound silence to sweep back into the grove, thick and heavy with unresolved, dangerous tension. "You think you're pretty tough, showing up out of nowhere with your attack mutt and playing the big hero?" The bearded logger growled defensively, his massive chest heaving as he pointed a thick, calloused, and grease-stained finger directly at Jack's chest. The underlying fear was undeniably evident in his shifting eyes, but it was rapidly being masked by a dark, simmering, and vengeful malice. He took a cautious step backward, gesturing sharply for his tattooed companion to begin retreating toward the treacherous, ash-covered slope they had originally descended from. "But you're making a monumental, fatal mistake, pal. This rare timber is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market, and we aren't about to just walk away from that kind of massive payday because of one guy playing soldier." He paused, a cruel, supremely ugly smile stretching across his weather-beaten, dirt-streaked face, revealing a row of badly yellowed teeth. "You see, we aren't doing this logging operation alone. We've got a whole crew waiting up on the main ridge, packing heavy transport equipment and possessing a whole lot less patience than we have. You might have gotten lucky right now, catching us off guard, but we're coming back tonight when it's pitch black. And when we do, we're bringing enough manpower to clear-cut this entire pathetic little valley. and we absolutely won't hesitate to bury anyone who gets in the way of our profit." With that final chilling promise hanging heavily in the damp, fragrant air, the two massive men turned abruptly on their heels, aggressively shoving their way through the lush green underbrush of the sanctuary. They scrambled clumsily and noisily up the steep, blackened incline of the outer ravine, quickly disappearing back into the thick, haunting gray fog of the devastated upper forest. Jack stood completely motionless, his tactical senses fully engaged, watching the distant tree line intently until the heavy, rhythmic crunching of their boots completely faded away, ensuring the immediate, physical threat had truly and safely departed. He knew with absolute, hardened certainty that men driven by that profound level of desperate greed didn't make empty, idle threats. The peaceful, hidden sanctuary was now officially running on borrowed time. The very moment the imposing loggers were entirely out of sight, the heavy, rusted iron pry bar slipped from Elias's severely trembling fingers, clattering loudly against a smooth river stone. The sudden, drastic drop in pure adrenaline caused the fragile, exhausted old man's weak knees to buckle entirely. Jack closed the short distance in 2 incredibly quick strides, his strong, steady hands gently but firmly catching Elias by the frail shoulders before he could collapse completely onto the damp earth. "Easy there, sir. I've got you. You're completely safe now," Jack murmured softly, his tone shifting instantly and seamlessly from lethal, commanding authority to deep, reassuring, and profoundly gentle empathy. He carefully guided Elias toward a large, moss-covered log near the massive base of the central cedar tree, helping him sit down to catch his breath. Duke trotted over immediately, finally dropping the ruined, saliva-soaked baseball cap onto the forest floor, and nudged his wet black nose gently against the old man's trembling knee, offering his own silent, highly intuitive brand of emotional comfort. It was then that Jack's trained eyes noticed a slow, steady trickle of bright crimson seeping through the torn, faded fabric of Elias's flannel shirt sleeve. The old man had scraped his forearm deeply and painfully against the rough, unforgiving bark of the ancient tree during his desperate, adrenaline-fueled standoff. "Let me take a proper look at that arm," Jack said gently, already reaching into the heavily modified cargo pocket of his uniform to retrieve a compact, military-grade, waterproof field trauma kit he never traveled without. He swiftly and carefully cleaned the jagged wound with a stinging antiseptic wipe, causing Elias to hiss slightly in pain before expertly wrapping it in a sterile, pressure-forming bandage. "My name is Jack, by the way, and this overly protective, hat-stealing thief right here is Duke," Jack introduced himself, offering a warm, genuinely disarming smile to help ground the profoundly shaken man. Elias looked down at the neatly bandaged arm, then up into the calm, steadfast hazel eyes of the complete stranger who had just miraculously saved his life and his late wife's precious legacy. "I am Elias," he whispered, his frail voice still shaking slightly, though healthy color was slowly returning to his pale, lined cheeks. "I simply cannot thank you enough, Jack. But those men—" "Down!" Jack finished securing the tight bandage, his expression hardening back into a look of absolute, unwavering tactical resolve. He looked up at the towering, majestic canopies of the ancient, silent cedars, then back to the worried old man. "Then we have a lot of hard work to do before nightfall, Elias, because I promise you, nobody is taking these trees today." The transition from the tense afternoon to the heavy, suffocating blanket of night was swift in the hidden valley. Inside the small, rustic cabin, the atmosphere was a fragile bubble of warmth against the encroaching mountain chill. A modest fire crackled cheerfully in a stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the worn wooden floorboards and illuminating shelves lined with dusty, leather-bound books and faded botanical diagrams. Jack sat quietly at a sturdy oak table, his large hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of dark, bitter coffee that Elias had brewed over the open flame. Outside, the majestic cedars stood as silent, towering silhouettes against a starless, overcast sky, their thick canopies momentarily shielding the sanctuary from the worsening weather. the stark contrast between the cozy, intimate interior of the cabin and the looming, malicious threat lurking somewhere in the devastated forest above hung heavy in the air. Duke lay sprawled luxuriously on a braided rug near the hearth, his dark eyes half closed as he soaked in the radiant heat, though his sharply pointed ears twitched subtly at every creak of the old timber. Elias, looking slightly more rested, but still carrying the profound weight of a deeply ingrained sorrow, eased himself into a battered rocking chair opposite Jack, his bandaged arm resting gently on his lap. The old man stared into the dancing orange flames for a long, poignant moment, as if carefully gathering the fragmented pieces of a sacred, fragile memory before offering them to the stranger who had defended his home. "You asked earlier why a frail old man would risk his life for a stand of trees," Elias began, his voice a soft, raspy whisper that commanded absolute attention in the quiet room. He reached over to a small side table and picked up a framed photograph, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the glass before tilting it so Jack could see. The picture showed a vibrant, smiling woman with sun-weathered skin, unruly graying hair tied back in a practical bandana, and hands deeply stained with rich dark soil. "This is Martha, my late wife. She wasn't just a nature lover, Jack. Martha was a brilliant, visionary botanist. While most people looked at a forest and saw lumber, she saw a complex, breathing organism that needed to be understood and fiercely protected. Decades ago, she realized that the changing climate and aggressive logging were irreparably damaging the native root systems in this region. She spent her entire life cultivating these specific cedars outside. They aren't ordinary trees. They are a highly resilient, specially bred hybrid designed to withstand extreme drought, resist invasive blights, and, most importantly, rapidly regenerate the soil's nutrient networks after catastrophic events." Elias paused, his pale eyes shimmering with unshed tears as he looked toward the cabin's small, fogged window. She knew the wildfires were getting worse. She planted this grove as a biological vault, a mother lode of strong seeds that could one day be used to heal the scarred earth above us when the inevitable inferno finally came. She poured her brilliant mind, her sweat, and eventually her failing health into this soil. When she passed away 5 years ago, she didn't leave behind a bank account or an estate. She left me these trees. She called them her children. Our children. The old man's voice finally cracked, betraying the immense agonizing burden of his solitary vigil. Those men today, they don't see salvation or a lifetime of brilliant science. They just see a paycheck. If they cut them down, they aren't just stealing wood. They are murdering Martha's legacy and condemning the surrounding forest to permanent ash. Jack listened in absolute, respectful silence, the profound gravity of Elias's words sinking deep into his chest. The soldier lowered his coffee mug, his sharp hazel eyes softening with a profound, unspoken empathy. In Elias's desperate, fiercely loyal protection of his late wife's legacy, Jack recognized a deeply familiar, agonizing echo of his own life. "I understand, Elias, more than you might think," Jack said quietly, the gravelly timbre of his voice laced with a raw, uncharacteristic vulnerability. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "In my line of work, you form bonds that go deeper than blood. You trust the men next to you with your life. But sometimes, despite all the training, all the tactics, and all the firepower, you can't bring everyone home." Jack paused, swallowing hard against the tight, familiar knot in his throat, momentarily haunted by flashes of chaotic firefights and deafening helicopters. "I lost 3 of my closest brothers in a single operation 2 years ago. Good men. Men who had families and futures that were just violently erased in a fraction of a second. I made it out, but a massive part of my soul stayed buried in that sand." Jack reached down, his large hand gently stroking Duke's thick, dark fur. The German shepherd immediately opened his eyes, lifting his heavy head to rest his chin comfortingly on Jack's combat boot. "When I came back, I was lost, was angry, hollow, and suffocating under the weight of surviving when they didn't." I was spiraling into a very dark place. Then they assigned me to Duke. He was a washout from the explosive detection program, too aggressive, too unpredictable after losing his previous handler. We were two broken, discarded pieces of collateral damage. But somehow, in trying to fix him, he ended up fixing me. He didn't offer pity. He just offered an unwavering, silent anchor that slowly pulled me back from the edge. Jack looked back up at Elias, a powerful, unspoken bond bridging the generational gap. We both have ghosts we're trying to honor, Elias. We both have legacies we're sworn to protect. I couldn't save my brothers over there. But I promise you, on my life, I will help you save Martha's children tonight. The poignant, healing silence that settled over the cabin was profound, thick with mutual respect and newly forged resolve. However, the momentary sanctuary of their shared vulnerability was abruptly and violently shattered. Duke, who had been completely relaxed against Jack's leg, suddenly went entirely rigid. His heavy head snapped up, his pointed ears pinning back tightly against his skull as he stared intensely at the solid wooden front door. A low, menacing, and deeply guttural growl began to vibrate continuously in his broad chest, a terrifying sound that instantly evaporated the warmth of the room. Jack's demeanor shifted in a microscopic fraction of a second. The empathetic, grieving man vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating, and highly lethal Navy SEAL. He stood up silently, his body instinctively dropping into a low, tactical crouch. At that exact moment, a sharp, rhythmic pinging sound began to echo off the rusted tin roof of the cabin. It started as a few isolated drops, then rapidly escalated into a heavy, driving downpour. The sky had finally broken, unleashing a torrential mountain storm. But it wasn't just the rain that had triggered Duke's infallible warning system. Through the sudden, chaotic noise of the pounding rain and the howling wind, a new, distinct sound emerged from the darkness of the tree line. The heavy, undeniable crunch of multiple boots marching aggressively through the mud, accompanied by the faint, metallic clinking of heavy chains and equipment. Jack's jaw tightened dangerously as he signaled for Elias to move away from the windows and retreat to the back of the cabin. The loggers hadn't waited for the dead of night as they had promised. They had used the incoming storm as acoustic and visual cover to mask their approach, arriving much earlier in greater numbers, and undoubtedly armed for a serious, violent confrontation. The siege of the hidden Eden had officially begun. The low, menacing growl vibrating in Duke's broad chest was an undeniable alarm bell that instantly fractured the cabin's fragile tranquility, plunging Jack right back into the deeply familiar, hyper-focused reality of an impending combat scenario. He held up a single, commanding hand, signaling for absolute silence as his highly trained ears strained to decipher the chaotic symphony of the escalating mountain storm. The rhythmic, heavy drumming of the torrential downpour against the rusted tin roof and the violent howling of the wind through the massive cedar branches masked much of the auditory landscape. But Duke's superior canine senses had detected the subtle, unnatural anomalies long before human ears ever could. The distant, heavy crunch of boots and the faint clinking of metal were echoing down from the steep, treacherous ridge of the burnt forest above, indicating that the hostile logging crew was aggressively navigating the descent much earlier than anticipated, undoubtedly using the chaotic weather as acoustic cover. Jack's hazel eyes hardened into cold, calculating slits as he immediately shifted gears from a sympathetic listener to a hardened tactical commander. "Elias, I need you to stay away from all the windows, secure the heavy deadbolt on this front door, and do not come out under any circumstances until I personally tell you it is safe," Jack ordered, his tone devoid of any previous warmth, replaced entirely by the sharp, authoritative cadence of a Navy SEAL preparing for a siege. He didn't wait for the trembling old man to argue or agree. He simply grabbed his heavy, weather-resistant tactical jacket from the back of a wooden chair, zipping it up smoothly as he moved toward the back door. Duke was already there, his thick tail rigid and his ears swiveling like radar dishes, fully understanding that they were transitioning from rest to active duty. Stepping out into the freezing, driving rain, Jack was immediately enveloped by the pitch-black darkness of the ancient grove. He needed to turn this natural sanctuary into a fortified defensive perimeter, and he had a terrifyingly narrow window of time to do it before the intruders fully breached the valley floor. Moving with the lethal, silent fluidity of a phantom, despite the blinding rain and thick, slippery mud, Jack immediately broke into a swift, purposeful jog toward Elias's dilapidated wooden toolshed near the edge of the property. He needed to utilize every available resource to create a series of effective, non-lethal traps designed to disorient, delay, and completely demoralize the incoming threat without causing fatal injuries. Inside the damp, musty shed, his tactical flashlight swept quickly over the chaotic clutter, his mind rapidly cataloging useful items. He grabbed several thick coils of sturdy nylon climbing rope, a rusty but functional trenching shovel, and an old burlap sack filled with empty, rattling tin soup cans. "All right, Duke, take point. Guard the northern perimeter and give me a silent signal if they breach the tree line," Jack whispered to the massive dog. Duke let out a nearly inaudible huff of acknowledgement, his dark form instantly melting away into the stormy shadows, acting as an invaluable, highly intelligent forward scout. Jack immediately went to work, his movements dictated by years of deeply ingrained muscle memory and survival training. He strategically strung the heavy nylon ropes low across the primary muddy pathways leading toward the oldest, most valuable cedar trees, tying them taut between thick, hidden roots to create devastating, invisible tripwires in the dark. Moving closer to the cabin's main approach, he used the shovel to rapidly excavate a wide, shallow pit in the soft, rain-soaked earth, working up a heavy sweat that quickly mingled with the freezing rain. He meticulously covered the treacherous hole with a fragile lattice of brittle cedar branches, thick layers of wet ferns, and a deceptive coating of mud, creating a perfect, natural-looking deadfall meant to trap a heavy man's leg and completely shatter his forward momentum. Finally, Jack expertly threaded the empty tin cans onto thin, nearly invisible strands of fishing line he found in his pocket, stringing them through the lower branches of the perimeter bushes. This makeshift, rudimentary acoustic alarm system would perfectly compensate for the blinding darkness and the deafening noise of the storm, guaranteeing that no one could sneak within 50 yards of Martha's precious children without announcing their presence. Throughout the grueling, high-paced preparation, Duke continuously patrolled the outer boundaries, his glowing eyes occasionally flashing in the darkness as he silently coordinated with Jack, ensuring his handler could focus entirely on fortifying the garden without being ambushed. Just as Jack secured the final knot on the tin can alarm system, wiping a thick layer of wet grime and rain from his forehead, the atmospheric pressure in the valley seemed to shift violently. Duke suddenly materialized from the thick underbrush, his body lowered in a predatory stalk, and nudged Jack's thigh urgently before pointing his heavy snout toward the only viable clearing that led into the depression. The storm continued to rage relentlessly, but a new, terrifying sound began to steadily overpower the howling wind and the drumming rain. It was the deep, guttural, mechanical roar of heavy, industrial-grade diesel engines violently downshifting. Two piercing, blinding beams of harsh yellow light suddenly tore through the thick, swirling fog and heavy rain, illuminating the charred skeletons of the upper ridge like a nightmare. A massive, heavily modified flatbed logging truck, outfitted with thick, reinforced steel push bumpers and aggressive off-road tires, aggressively breached the fire line, its heavy wheels churning up massive chunks of black mud and ash as it slammed to a halt just at the edge of the hidden valley. The deafening hiss of air brakes echoed ominously through the ancient cedars. The heavy metal doors of the cab and the trailing escort vehicle swung open forcefully. It wasn't just the two thugs from the afternoon. 5 large, intimidating figures stepped out into the harsh glare of the headlights, their heavy boots hitting the mud with sickening thuds. There was the hulking, bearded logger and his tattooed companion, looking even angrier than before, but now they were backed by 3 highly imposing reinforcements. One was a towering, heavily muscled man, carrying a massive steel sledgehammer resting easily on his shoulder. Another was a wiry, dangerous-looking individual holding a high-powered, military-style flashlight. And the final figure, the apparent leader of the crew, remained partially shrouded in a heavy, dark raincoat, moving with a calm, terrifyingly confident swagger. They carried thick chains, heavy towing cables, and several massive commercial-grade chainsaws slung over their broad shoulders. This was no longer a simple opportunistic theft. It was a highly coordinated, heavily equipped siege designed to completely eradicate the ancient sanctuary. Jack slowly drew back into the deepest shadows of a towering cedar, resting his hand firmly on Duke's tense neck, fully prepared to unleash the brutal, unyielding defensive nightmare he had meticulously crafted in the dark. The torrential downpour transformed the hidden valley into a chaotic, slippery battleground, the howling wind and driving rain perfectly masking the lethal, calculated movements of its solitary defender. The 5 heavily armed intruders pushed aggressively past the tree line, their thick boots squelching deeply into the saturated earth, sweeping beams from high-powered flashlights through the ancient, towering cedars. Jack stood perfectly still against the deeply textured bark of a colossal trunk, his breathing slowed to a deliberate, silent rhythm. In the pitch-black, stormy environment, his digital woodland camouflage uniform functioned exactly as designed, breaking up his human silhouette and rendering him entirely invisible against the wet, mossy backdrop of the ancient forest. He was no longer a man. He was a phantom woven directly into the fabric of the woods. The overconfident loggers moved with clumsy, arrogant haste, their heavy chainsaws knocking against their sides, completely unaware that they were walking directly into a meticulously prepared gauntlet. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clatter echoed through the lower brush, the improvised tin can alarm violently rattling. The wiry, dangerous-looking man holding the primary flashlight cursed under his breath, stepping instinctively backward to investigate the noise. That single, reactive step was his undoing. His heavy boot found no solid ground, plunging violently through the deceptive lattice of wet ferns and brittle branches Jack had constructed earlier. The man let out a panicked yelp as he sank waist-deep into the muddy pit, his heavy flashlight tumbling from his grip and rolling into the wet grass, casting an erratic, blinding beam across the forest floor. The sudden loss of illumination and the panicked cries of their comrade instantly fractured the group's coordination. Taking full advantage of the blinding confusion, Jack detached from the shadows with terrifying speed. He glided silently behind the heavily tattooed logger who had previously threatened Elias, executing a flawless, non-lethal brachial stun, a swift, precise strike to the side of the neck that instantly disrupted the man's nervous system, sending him crumpling harmlessly and quietly into the soft mud before he could even raise a fist. As Jack systematically and silently dismantled the perimeter threat, the towering, heavily muscled logger carrying the massive steel sledgehammer realized that fighting an invisible enemy in the dark was a losing battle. Seeking a tactical advantage, the giant pivoted his lumbering frame away from the chaotic tree line and stomped aggressively toward the small, vulnerable cabin, intending to drag the old man out to force the hidden soldier to surrender. Inside the dimly lit structure, Elias huddled rigidly near the cold hearth, his frail hands desperately clutching the photograph of his late wife, listening in sheer terror to the heavy, booming footsteps echoing on the wooden porch. The giant logger sneered aggressively, raising his heavy steel sledgehammer high above his broad shoulders, preparing to brutally shatter the reinforced glass of the front window. But Jack had not left the sanctuary undefended. Duke, who had been commanded to remain inside the cabin to act as Elias's personal bodyguard, sensed the imminent breach. As the heavy steel hammer began its destructive descent, the massive German shepherd lunged ferociously toward the window from the inside. Duke's powerful front paws slammed against the wooden sill, his thick jaws snapping wildly mere inches from the glass as he unleashed a thunderous, savage barrage of barks that vibrated with pure, unadulterated canine fury. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of the vicious attack erupting from the seemingly empty cabin startled the giant logger to his core. He flinched violently, his heavy boots losing traction on the rain-slicked porch, and he staggered awkwardly backward, the heavy head of the sledgehammer swinging wildly off target and embedding itself deeply into the wooden railing. That critical, split-second distraction was all the phantom in the woods needed. Jack materialized from the pouring rain behind the staggering brute, dropping low to execute a devastating, sweeping tactical kick to the back of the giant's knees. The massive man's legs buckled instantly under his own immense weight, sending him crashing down the porch stairs and splashing heavily into the muddy earth, completely incapacitated by the sheer force of the fall and the undeniable superiority of military close-quarters combat. The bearded logger from the afternoon attempted to aggressively charge through the brush to aid his fallen comrades, but he met an identical, deeply humiliating fate, swiftly disarmed of his chainsaw and neutralized by Jack's relentless, shadowy strikes before he could even register the attack. In less than 3 minutes, the heavily armed siege had been entirely decimated by a single, unseen force. However, the perilous ordeal was far from over. The leader of the logging crew, still completely shrouded in a thick, dark, water-resistant raincoat that deeply obscured his facial features, stood alone amidst the groaning bodies of his defeated crew. Realizing his men had been systematically dismantled by a ghost, a dark, explosive rage finally broke through his previously calm demeanor. Enraged by the humiliating defeat, he stepped firmly into the center of the clearing, perfectly illuminated by the harsh, erratic beam of the flashlight still resting in the mud. He reached aggressively beneath his heavy slicker and drew a long, gleaming pump-action shotgun, racking a heavy shell into the chamber with a harsh, metallic clack that easily cut through the drumming noise of the storm. He didn't aim the lethal weapon wildly into the dark, threatening shadows. Instead, with chilling, deliberate malice, he pivoted and leveled the heavy steel barrel directly at the thick trunk of the oldest, most magnificent cedar in the valley, the undisputed, beating heart of Martha's botanical legacy. "Enough of these pathetic games," the hidden leader roared, his voice a distorted, furious bellow that carried a strange, underlying emotional crack over the howling wind. He reached into his pocket and forcefully pulled out a red emergency road flare, striking the cap to ignite a sputtering, blinding crimson flame that cast demonic, dancing shadows across the ancient, textured bark of the massive tree. "I know you're out there, soldier. Step out into the light right now, or I swear to God I will blow this trunk wide open and burn this precious weed to the ground." The fiery, apocalyptic threat hung heavily in the freezing, saturated air, creating a paralyzing, terrifying standoff. The tactical advantage of the shadows had been completely neutralized by pure, destructive desperation, forcing Jack to halt his silent, unseen advance, the fate of the entire ancient forest suddenly resting precariously on the razor's edge of a madman's loaded weapon. The crimson glare of the emergency road flare hissed violently in the freezing, saturated air, casting long, bleeding shadows across the deeply textured bark of the ancient cedar tree. Jack, still perfectly concealed within the impenetrable darkness of the surrounding brush, rapidly calculated the terrifying tactical geometry of the standoff. The desperate, heavy-breathing leader stood mere feet from the colossal trunk, his trembling finger hovering dangerously over the trigger of a pump-action shotgun, the sputtering red flare threatening to ignite the dry, fibrous underlayers of the majestic tree. Jack knew that rushing a desperate man holding a volatile incendiary device and a loaded weapon was a catastrophic gamble that could instantly destroy the very legacy he had sworn to protect. Taking a slow, deliberate breath to steady his racing heart, the seasoned Navy SEAL made the agonizing decision to relinquish his absolute tactical advantage. With his strong, calloused hands raised slowly and visibly to shoulder height, Jack detached himself from the comforting safety of the shadows, his heavy combat boots squelching softly into the thick mud as he stepped into the harsh, erratic circle of red light. "Stand down. I'm right here, completely unarmed," Jack stated, his deep, gravelly voice remarkably calm and devoid of any aggression, attempting to instantly de-escalate the explosive tension. The hooded leader jerked his weapon slightly toward Jack, his chest heaving under the heavy, waterlogged raincoat, but he kept the barrel predominantly focused on the ancient wood, his posture screaming of erratic, unpredictable panic. Just as Jack took another cautious, measured step forward, hoping to close the agonizing distance, the heavy oak door of the small cabin abruptly creaked open behind him. Despite Jack's previous strict orders to remain barricaded inside, Elias had emerged into the freezing night. The old man was holding a flickering, kerosene-soaked makeshift torch, his frail silhouette trembling violently against the chaotic backdrop of the storm. Beside him walked Duke, but the massive German shepherd's behavior had drastically and inexplicably changed. Instead of the savage, aggressively protective posture he had displayed earlier, Duke's ears were flattened in a strange, submissive confusion, his wet nose actively sniffing the cold air as if trying to decipher a deeply familiar yet heavily corrupted scent. As the torrential downpour finally began to fracture, allowing a few piercing, ethereal beams of pale moonlight to break through the thick, churning canopy of storm clouds, Elias slowly descended the wooden porch steps. "Jack, no. Please don't let him hurt the trees," the old man rasped, his fragile voice barely carrying over the dying wind as he held the flickering torch higher, desperately trying to illuminate the face of the man threatening to erase his late wife's profound life's work. The wavering golden light of the fire violently clashed with the harsh crimson glare of the road flare, washing over the clearing and finally striking the leader's obscured face. As the man aggressively ripped the heavy, rain-soaked hood back from his head to glare at the old man, the breath completely vanished from Elias's lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. The man standing before them was not a nameless, faceless corporate mercenary or a hardened timber smuggler. It was Luke. He was a man in his early 30s, possessing his mother's sharp, intelligent jawline and his father's pale, sorrowful eyes, though his features were now deeply hardened by years of harsh living and profound, unresolved anger. His unkempt, damp brown hair clung to his forehead, and he carried the tragic, unmistakable aura of a deeply broken boy trapped in a desperate man's body, smelling faintly of stale rain, cheap whiskey, and overwhelming exhaustion. The heavy iron pry bar Elias had previously held clattered uselessly to the muddy ground. "Luke," Elias whispered, the single, fragile syllable carrying a decade of unimaginable heartache, desperate searching, and profound parental grief. The heavy shotgun in Luke's hands trembled violently, his knuckles turning stark white as the devastating reality of the intimate confrontation set in. The imposing, terrifying leader of the logging crew had instantly dissolved into an estranged, deeply wounded son, and the fiercely defended, sacred valley suddenly became the agonizing stage for a profoundly broken family's ultimate reckoning. The profound, shocking revelation hit Jack like a physical blow to the chest, his trained combat instincts instantly paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming emotional complexity of the battlefield. This was no longer a simple mission to protect property. This was a deeply tragic, bleeding wound of the human heart. "Don't you dare look at me like that, old man!" Luke suddenly roared, his voice cracking violently with an explosive mixture of profound rage and agonizing, long-suppressed tears. He pointed the heavy shotgun barrel aggressively back at the colossal cedar, his pale eyes wide and frantic. "You and Mom, you loved these miserable, stupid trees more than you ever loved your own son. While I was struggling, begging for just a fraction of your attention, Mom was out here in the dirt, talking to the roots, treating this pathetic grove like her real family." Luke's chest heaved with hysterical, ragged sobs, the heavy burden of his painful childhood finally spilling out into the cold night air. "I owe dangerous people a lot of money, Dad. My entire life is a complete, miserable wreck, and all I could think about was that you two were sitting on a literal gold mine of rare timber, completely ignoring my existence. I hired these guys to cut it all down, to finally erase her precious, agonizing obsession, and to take what I felt was rightfully owed to me for years of being completely invisible in my own home. The bitter, poisonous resentment poured from his lips, painting a heartbreaking picture of a child who had felt entirely overshadowed by a monumental botanical legacy. He firmly believed that destroying the ancient forest was not just a desperate financial necessity, but a profoundly symbolic, vengeful act required to finally sever the suffocating, painful ghost of his mother's neglect. The heavy, agonizing weight of Luke's tearful confession hung in the freezing air, momentarily silencing the remaining echoes of the dying storm. Elias stood completely paralyzed for a long, heartbreaking moment, the flickering torchlight revealing a devastating mosaic of profound guilt, infinite sorrow, and shattering realization etched deeply into his lined face. He suddenly realized that in their passionate, single-minded quest to heal the broken earth, he and Martha had unknowingly fractured the most precious, fragile life they had ever created. With a slow, profoundly deliberate motion, Elias let the burning torch drop harmlessly into a puddle of rainwater, extinguishing the flame with a quiet hiss. Stripped of all defenses, the frail old man began to walk slowly, painfully, straight toward the lethal, trembling barrel of the pump-action shotgun. Jack tensed instinctively, his muscles coiling to intervene, but a powerful, invisible force rooted him to the spot. He knew, with the deep, tragic intuition of a soldier who had witnessed countless broken souls, that this was a chasm only a father could cross. "You are right, Luke. God forgive me, you are so entirely right." Elias wept softly, his fragile hands reaching out into the cold space between them. "We were so blind. We wanted to leave a beautiful world for you, but we entirely forgot to live in it with you. I am so incredibly sorry, my son. So sorry." He didn't stop walking until the cold steel muzzle of the loaded weapon pressed gently against his own chest. The ultimate agonizing climax of the night was not born of violence, but of a profound, devastating surrender. Elias stood with his arms open wide, offering his own fragile life in exchange for his son's deeply wounded soul, creating a terrifying, beautiful moment where the raw, desperate pull of pure family love violently collided with the blinding, poisonous grip of a decade's worth of resentment, leaving the entire forest holding its breath. The freezing, suffocating silence of the hidden valley was shattered only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the deeply wounded son. Elias stood entirely defenseless, his fragile chest pressed willingly against the cold, unyielding steel of the loaded shotgun barrel, offering a heartbreaking sacrifice of unconditional parental love. Luke's pale, tear-streaked face twisted in sheer agony, his trembling hands gripping the weapon so tightly that his knuckles were entirely bloodless. He was trapped in a paralyzing, agonizing purgatory between the burning desire for vindication and the horrifying reality of destroying the only family he had left. Jack, observing the profound tragedy unfolding before him, knew that tactical maneuvers and physical force were entirely useless here. He took a slow, deliberate breath, channeling the profound, agonizing wisdom he had earned in the darkest corners of the world. "Luke," Jack spoke, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the damp, tense air with a remarkably gentle, grounding authority. "I have spent my entire adult life walking through fire, watching good men die for causes they believed in. I know exactly what it looks like when a soul is completely hollowed out by grief and anger." Jack took a slow, measured step closer, his hands still visibly empty, his hazel eyes locking onto Luke's frantic gaze. "You think your mother abandoned you for this forest? You think she loved the bark and the leaves more than her own flesh and blood. But you are looking at it entirely wrong, son. She didn't plant these majestic cedars to replace you. She was a botanist who understood that the world was slowly burning, and she was terrified of the ashes you would inherit. She planted these highly resilient, magnificent trees to build a root system strong enough, deep enough, to anchor the earth so that you would always have a place to return to when your own life caught fire. She wasn't ignoring you, Luke. She was desperately trying to build a sanctuary for you." The profound, unexpected truth in the seasoned soldier's words hit Luke with the devastating force of a physical blow. The impenetrable, toxic armor of bitter resentment and manufactured hatred that he had meticulously built around his heart for a decade instantly fractured and shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The heavy pump-action shotgun, previously a terrifying instrument of blind vengeance, suddenly became an unbearable, agonizing weight in his hands. With a sharp, guttural sob that seemed to tear itself loose from the very depths of his fractured soul, Luke completely relinquished his grip. The lethal weapon slipped from his trembling fingers, splashing harmlessly into the thick, freezing mud. His knees immediately buckled under the crushing weight of his profound realization and overwhelming guilt, sending him collapsing into the dark earth. Elias didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. The frail old man dropped to his knees in the soaking mud, wrapping his thin, trembling arms fiercely around the broad, shaking shoulders of his lost son. They clung to each other desperately in the cold, wet dirt, two deeply broken men finally mourning the decades of lost time and the silent, suffocating misunderstandings that had nearly destroyed them both. As their heartbreaking, cathartic sobs echoed softly through the ancient grove, the oppressive, stormy darkness finally began to surrender. The very first tentative rays of the morning sun crested the charred, jagged ridge of the upper forest, piercing the dissipating gray fog with brilliant, ethereal beams of pure, golden light. The warm, radiant dawn perfectly illuminated the massive, deeply textured trunks of Martha's ancient cedars, transforming the previously terrifying, shadow-filled valley into a breathtaking, peaceful cathedral of vibrant, enduring life. The horrific storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, sacred stillness that felt like a gentle, healing exhalation from the battered earth itself. The profound tranquility of the golden morning was eventually interrupted by the distant, rhythmic crunching of heavy tires descending the precarious, ash-covered access road. Jack had quietly utilized his military-grade satellite radio during the chaotic preparation of the perimeter defenses hours ago, sending a silent, encrypted distress beacon directly to the local authorities. Within moments, two rugged, heavily modified utility vehicles, adorned with the official crest of the State Forestry Department, rolled cautiously into the clearing. From the leading vehicle stepped two senior forest rangers. The lead ranger was a stern, highly pragmatic man in his late 50s with a closely cropped gray mustache, wearing a crisp, olive-green uniform adorned with a polished silver badge, his sharp, observant eyes quickly assessing the chaotic aftermath of the battlefield. His partner was slightly younger, a tall, athletic woman with her dark hair pulled into a tight, practical bun, moving with the confident, no-nonsense efficiency of a seasoned law enforcement officer. They immediately moved to secure the groaning, mud-caked loggers who were still hopelessly entangled in Jack's meticulously crafted, non-lethal traps, expertly binding their wrists with heavy nylon zip ties. As the Rangers prepared to march the defeated mercenaries up the ridge to the waiting transport vehicles, the lead officer turned his stern gaze toward the small, tearful family huddled near the cabin. Elias gently pulled away from his son, standing up with a newfound, quiet dignity despite his ruined, mud-stained clothes. He approached the commanding ranger, his voice steady and resolute. "Officer, these men you have arrested are ruthless poachers who unlawfully trespassed to destroy this protected sanctuary," Elias stated firmly, looking back at Luke, who was still kneeling with his head bowed in deep shame. "But this young man, this is my son. He made a terrible, misguided mistake, but he did not harm us, and he is the one who ultimately stopped the violence. I humbly ask that you leave him here with me. We have a great deal of our own internal damage to repair." Jack stepped forward smoothly, his imposing, disciplined presence carrying undeniable weight. "The old man is telling the truth, Ranger. The mercenaries were the sole aggressors. The son simply lost his way and found it again just in time." The stern ranger looked between the hardened soldier, the resolute father, and the broken son, eventually offering a brief, understanding nod of professional discretion, opting to haul away only the hired muscle and leaving the deeply fractured family to mend their own profound wounds. With the immediate physical threat permanently neutralized and the deeply emotional storm finally settled, Jack knew his mission in the hidden valley was officially complete. He stood at the edge of the ancient cedar grove, the golden morning light highlighting the sharp, weary angles of his face. He reached down, his large, calloused hands casually brushing a thick layer of dried, crumbling mud from the heavy fabric of his uniform, the familiar digital woodland pattern now blending perfectly with the vibrant, sunlit sanctuary he had helped save. Elias and Luke walked slowly toward him, the profound gratitude shining clearly in their exhausted eyes, entirely eliminating the need for any grand, poetic speeches of thanks. Jack offered them both a firm, deeply respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, agonizing journey through the darkness. "All right, Duke, it's time to go," Jack called out softly. The massive German shepherd, who was happily sniffing a patch of fresh, vibrant green ferns, immediately trotted back to his handler's side, his thick tail wagging in a steady, contented rhythm. Together, the two inseparable companions turned their backs to the hidden Eden, beginning the long, slow hike back up the steep, blackened ridge toward the matte black pickup truck waiting on the highway. As Jack looked out over the vast, charred expanse of the ruined national forest, he noticed dozens of tiny, resilient green shoots defiantly pushing their way up through the toxic gray ash. He smiled, a rare, genuine expression of profound peace settling deep into his chest. He realized then that the most vital, enduring lesson of the forest was not merely about preserving the physical wood or fighting off the destructive flames. Sometimes, truly protecting a legacy meant possessing the courage to dig deep into the blackened soil of the past, not just to save the magnificent ancient trees, but to patiently, lovingly save the lost, wandering souls who had forgotten how to grow. With a renewed, unshakable sense of purpose, the soldier and his loyal dog climbed into the truck, starting the engine and continuing their long journey toward the new base, leaving behind a beautifully resurrected world where the deepest roots had finally nurtured the most beautiful, promising new shoots. If this story of Jack, Duke, and the Hidden Valley touched your heart today, please share this video with someone who might need a little healing. Maybe it is a friend who is going through a tough time, or a family member you have not spoken to in a while. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you had to rebuild something beautiful from the ashes of your own life. I truly read every single one of your stories, and please subscribe to the channel so we can continue this wonderful journey of growth and learning together. Until next time, keep your roots deep and your heart open.